Guthrie, and this is the Long Letter Podcast. And I have my co-host here today.
Hi, I'm Nate Judd. We're finally getting to chapter 1. It's been a month.
We did one thing on the introduction, and now we're on chapter 1. Yeah. So at this pace, we should finish in like 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. If life just could stop and everything else.
Yeah. It's been busy, and it's been just a kind of a chaotic time. So, and I think we can all agree that your wife participated in that.
Her surgery.
Her gallbladder did anyways. So.
Yep. Threw a wrench in all the plans.
Yeah, we're gonna put that one up on the gallbladder there. I think that's fair.
I think she's fine with that. Thump under the bus.
No, it's just been a crazy time. And for you watching the video, if the video ends up being a part of this, we're broadcasting from a nondescript location in Centralia. Anyway, so we're moving around. We're more mobile than we've had to be in the past. So, anyways, how you doing, Nate?
I'm doing pretty good.
Doing all right.
It's a beautiful day today.
The weather is definitely contributing to the desire to want to do anything.
Yes, it does help tremendously.
After the 4th winter, I got a little tired of it.
Yeah, the long, wet, dark.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always winter, never Christmas. So, okay. So this book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, I've written about it. A lot of people have read it. And if you're interested in the introduction to it, go back and listen to episode 10, which covers kind of what Kevin Nye, the author, is doing here. So we'll just jump right in. And we're both kind of pressed for time, so we're going to try to get this into...
you should stop saying that because it never helps.
I know. It just makes every time I say that, it makes it longer, doesn't it? Okay, so the title of this chapter is Seeing and Being Seen. So everything in this chapter kind of hangs off the idea of how we see something and how we perceive something. Also, to the listeners, if you hear rumbling stuff in the background, our nondescript location has a main road right next to it. So, and I'm not even going to fight it, and we're just going to lean into it.
Oh, yeah.
So the language of seeing. So he opens with this sort of throughout Scripture, imagery of eyes, sight, and blindness is used to denote more than literal seeing. It often signifies someone's ability to perceive God's truth, purpose, or values. And so he starts out that this chapter is sort of an invitation to see differently. Mm-hmm. And what is your experience in what you do now? The things you've done in the past. Like, did you have that sort of kind of a changing of the way you see things?
Yeah, and I was thinking about this and thinking back to when I was a kid. I remember driving in the car with my grandma and like seeing somebody on the side of the road, like at the corner of an intersection, and her reaching over and locking the door and just like giving off the impression like they're dangerous, they're different than us. We need to be protected from them, and like. I don't think she said anything, but just the impression like that if somebody's outside that they're dangerous. And like growing up with that and kind of being drawn into service in my youth group experience and things like that, doing like Bridgetown. I don't know if you ever did that.
I didn't, but I know.
Yeah,
a lot of people
went down to Portland and did Night Strike, and that was, I think it was good for what it was. It opened your eyes to serving people. Mm-hmm. And just kind of the complexity of human life. It's not like what I experienced. And then pastoring in Centralia at Bethel downtown and meeting people and getting to know their stories was even more life-changing, eye-opening.
So like what I'm seeing here, though, what's interesting about what you're saying is that there's a proximity effect. The closer you get to people that are living on the margins like that, you see them differently as you get to know them. And I've kind of experienced the same thing.
I liked in his story, he tells the story of having the dream because he's going to go to the church, the Penn City,
right,
and the homeless church, if you will, he calls it. And he has the dream, and in the dream, it's not scary. Like in the dream, he's not afraid.
Which, and like he'll get into this here where so where he talks about, because he was a middle school pastor.
Yeah.
and for a big church, and ended up looking into this Penn Avenue Church, which is in Oklahoma, and he has this dream, and the dream pushes him from probably not going to look into it to, well, a sort of reluctant, like, okay, let's check it out.
Yeah.
Now, the dream isn't like a portent. It isn't like
It's not anything close to reality.
No, it was just like literally a weird dream, which is, it was just an odd situation. And he,
Well, one of the things that stood out to me though was he says he when thinking about it, he was scared. What if I don't like it? And then he said, scarier still, what if I do like it? Like there was this fear, like I'm going to get drawn into this and end up feeling
it could
like
change. What if it changes me?
Yeah,
Which is always a fear.
What if it changes the way I see things?
Yeah. And there is that. I mean, when I, closed the proximity that I had with homeless and got to know more of the stories and people that live on the streets, I don't know. There's two things that kind of happen. One, you develop sort of a higher tolerance for weird stuff that happens. And then the other side of that is you recognize that that they're a person, right? And that's not to say that there isn't problematic issues or things like that. It's just that you do start to see them different. You develop friends who are homeless, which is a very odd, thing.
Yeah. And you've experienced that with different people around Gather. And I one story real quick. I remember a guy came to Bethel downtown when I was there, and he met with us beforehand, and he told us that he was Jesus. I don't know if you met Jesus. Did that guy come to Gather too?
I want to say yes.
Well, I met him, and like we were trying to be kind to him.
To be fair, Jesus is at
every church. Yeah.
Well, we're talking about a different type of Jesus. Okay.
He said he was Jesus, and so during the sermon, I'm standing on the platform, and he literally gets up and starts walking towards me.
Oh, I remember this.
And
not that I was there. I remember hearing about it.
Before the service, I went to like all the guys I know. I'm like, hey, just help me out. Watch this guy. I don't think he's dangerous, but
don't let Jesus get to the stage.
And sure enough, he gets up, and I'm like making eyes at this, like, help me out here. And he made it all the way up. And I think I was like, do you want to say something?
And you gave him a microphone.
I don't know if he wanted me to give him a microphone.
That seems like a good idea.
I didn't give it to him, but I was like, dude, and finally everybody kind of came. Right. But we took a moment right there, and we recognized his humanity, and we prayed for him.
Yeah.
And like, it wasn't like look at this. It's disturbance to our...
Right. Kick him out or whatever. It's a... I mean, that's what I say. You just kind of build a higher tolerance for weird stuff. Mm-hmm. And we've had individuals that gather. There was a period there where I felt like I was just escorting people, out the door to talk to them who are having usually a very chaotic mental health issue at that moment or whatever. Mm-hmm. None of them have been dangerous. None of them have whatever. That's not to say that can't happen, right. But functional, like we've raised our kids here. We have 4 kids. We've raised them since they were just little kids. And they run around and they whatever. And it hasn't been, it's not as dangerous as it feels. It's weird. Right. It's odd. You're going to have strange, behaviors crop up here and there. And like what I found in my time here is just you roll with it, and try to divert it, try to help people ground themselves. There's strategies that you just kind of start to develop. For the most part, it's not, it doesn't have to be they don't have to be terribly disruptive or anything. It's not unnerving once you figure out what's going on. And so, yeah, it's weird.
And they're people.
Yeah.
And that can't ever be lost in it.
Yeah. No, I get it. And so he goes to Penn Avenue, and he says it's just shockingly ordinary.
Yeah.
And he says so much holy and transformative work happens in the innocuous moments when people are simply together, sharing an experience, participating in an activity, and being humans in community. And, he kind of ends his chapter, or this part of the chapter, on something he had written in a journal where he said the only thing more profound than feeding the homeless is eating with them. Mm-hmm. And like me personally, I feel like the rhetoric here, he gets a little higher off the ground than I like. I get what he's saying. I don't think, as somebody who's eaten more than a few meals with homeless people. It's not like a profound thing. Usually it's just a very odd thing. And after a while, it just becomes a normal thing.
Yeah. And I think we talked about this. I think for me, like when I read that, I think, and he gets into it a little bit more, but that what he's trying to do is say we're leveling the playing field. I'm not just serving you, I'm with you. And like that,
Right,
that's the profound moment, right? Is like, whether it's eating with them or hanging out with them or just having a conversation as two people, not I'm here to serve you. What can I do for you? Like
it's like a washing the feet sort of moment where, you know, the hierarchy exists. And when that hierarchy is, you know, challenged, you get a different, like that's where it becomes profound. I don't think it's just profound in and of itself. I think just like what you realize you're doing or how it changes you can be profound.
It wouldn't be wise to advertise, come down and have a meal with the homeless and experience the most profound thing ever. And people just line up at the door to walk in and sit down and share a meal with somebody who's experiencing homelessness. Like that's not
exploitive
it.
too.
Right.
You know, people that, these are people, right? So they're not like a zoo exhibit to go be seen and interrogated or you know whatever, treating them like people because they are people. And we have a lot of dehumanizing postures toward people, and it's just that's everybody. That's not like
and what's interesting, is that there's almost a lack of profundity to it. Just when you do it over and over again, that it just becomes regular life with people. Like having a lunch with an elderly gentleman who visits the cafe who got a new flip phone, his first cell phone ever. And he's like, I don't know what to do with this. And they call me. I'm like young, apparently.
So did he go back to 2008 and buy a flip phone? And then...
I don't know how he got it, but he had it. And so we're trying to figure it out. And anyway, he saw my Mariner hat and he just goes, hey, I got a Mariner hat. I bought it I got it from the thrift store down the way, and I don't ever wear it. I'm not a Mariner fan. It's signed by somebody. Would you want it? And so he's offering me this Mariner hat because it's just a regular interaction. It's not like in that sense, there's not something profound about it. I got the hat right here, and it's got signatures.
It does have signatures.
It's got scribbles on it.
It could be anybody.
I don't know, but like
I think this is the towel boy.
So he didn't have it with him. He said, "I'm going to bring it to you tomorrow," and so he gave it to me today.
And it's like barely been worn. Looks like.
Anyway, so like that's just one of those moments where it's like the barrier between me and him, and me serving, and me having all these things, and it's just like
a relationship.
It just washes out.
Yeah, it's a relationship, and
did we got his phone going?
That's the most important thing.
But because he's not close to a grandkid or something like that to help him.
No, my father-in-law had to upgrade phones. It was a huge problem.
Yeah,
and he came over and was just like at the end of his rope, and so like Emily and I sat down with him, and I mean it was like 3 hours on the phone and doing all this other stuff because they didn't quite port it over correctly. Anyways. No, those are very difficult things to maneuver. If you don't have family or friends in the area, then it's like, having somebody that can walk you through it is like critically important.
And that's cool when like just the regular things of life, you recognize that they're still there, you know, aside from somebody's housing status, aside from somebody's like socioeconomic status, there are just regular old things in life that everybody has to navigate, like technology.
And we all need help. We can't do it all. I hate phones. I absolutely hate them. And people are like, "Oh, but you work in technology." I could care less about. I couldn't care less about phones. I love it when I misuse that phrase. Anyways, so he kind of moves into seeing himself in the story, and this is kind of sort of autobiography of the author as well. His experience moving into these circles and trying to, navigate his changing views. And so, he gets into more of the academic study. So there's the functional, like where you're placing yourself, where you're going to be around homeless people more.
He's working at Penn Avenue.
Right.
And then he goes to study in seminary.
Fuller Theological Seminary in California. And so in there, he's studying the Minor Prophets and Luke, the Sermon on the Mount, and James, the letter of James, that's a fiery one.
Which I thought he uses totally eviscerates the rich.
Yeah,
I like that language. It's like, oh man.
Which is funny. I mean, And, this is the sort of stuff I love talking about because, Martin Luther considered the book of, or the letter of James to be an epistle of straw. He absolutely hated it. But he's an important part of the discussion on this stuff and why and all that stuff. I love weighing that and kind of, digging into this stuff. But he goes into these things and he's just starting to see this, and he kind of relates it to liberation theology. Quote, God's preferential option for the poor. And he quotes, Gustavo Gutierrez, Leonardo Boff, and James Cone. And we had been talking like of those liberation theologians, like James Cone is the only one I've read a little bit from. But I've read a lot from people who've been inspired by liberation theology. But this just kind of idea of the sort of preferential option for, he says the poor, but it's also really the marginalized, those that are always kind of finding themselves on the outskirts of society with a sort of diminished voice. And if you kind of start looking at things from that perspective, you see that that population isn't always made up of the same people. Things change and people find themselves, displaced or whatever. And so, he goes on to say that to be followers of Jesus requires that Christians walk with and be committed to the poor. When they do, they experience an encounter with the Lord who is simultaneously revealed and hidden in the faces of the poor. That's a quote from Gutierrez. And I think that the last part of the sentence, simultaneously revealed and hidden in the faces of the poor. The revealed thing, the hiddenness of it.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that as I was reviewing this chapter of, it's not like so much that somebody is hiding this perspective or hiding these faces, or it's not like an active hiding. I feel like it's something of a passive, the way we look at things, right? Like, it's more in how we're interpreting what we're seeing and less of how it actually is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It puts it on us to constantly be aware of how our vision of the world, the way we see the world, the way we're interpreting the world, both informs us, but also needs to be challenged. We have reactions to people that happen immediately that might not be fair. They might not be on point or whatever.
Yeah. And ultimately that language, I mean, that's not just made up by liberation theologians. Like, that's language that directly comes from Matthew 25, which
the minor prophets
and the minor prophets, and where, you read them and you study it. I remember doing this in college too, and really reading and understanding, like, God's upset because of the way that they're neglecting those that are on the margins and the injustice that's going on.
And the challenge was, and so were you at one point. Right? Like, it's this, we forget.
Yeah, God's people, I should say, are
right.
Yeah.
Like that we could be somebody that both suffers from, being on the margins, and we can be the one that, holds this stigma for others that are on the margins. It's sort of kind of like a humanizing the whole situation.
Yeah.
And making sure that, like, the systems we participate in, just be very aware at the type of margins that it creates. And so he talks about, he kind of shifts how he sees himself in the story, and he kind of ends it on this idea of a hero complex or a Messiah complex, which is, I think, I can't think of a single person that doesn't get into this work or is like supportive of it, that doesn't somehow come across having to wrestle with that hero complex.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I mean, and I don't, so like I've said this before many times, and you can ask anybody I gather, but people are surprised to find out like I have a day job unrelated to any of this stuff. And, I always make the joke that I just kind of have stolen valor. Like, I have a lot of friends
to associate it.
Yeah. And it's because I care. I am passionate about these things. But there's so many people doing the work, and that I'm trying to recognize, I'm trying to like learn from and stuff. And so, but there is the real risk of the hero complex taking place. And it's not always intentional. It can be kind of, and I guess that's the thing, is kind of an insidious thing where, go ahead.
I remember, I mean, I've dealt with that in my life continually, as I seek to follow the call of God on my life, that it can become a thing where it feels like you become more important to it than you are. I think a missionary, like when I went to Argentina, even in the training leading up to that, they're like reminding us, don't have a martyr complex, which is another way I think of kind of twisting that. But to just, I think once you actually experience it, for me, my experience did the opposite. It did not make me feel like a hero when I was in Argentina. It made me feel like a nobody. And I felt so like, I don't know, maybe that was a good thing for me. But other people looked at me a different way. And they looked at me like especially in foreign countries, like in Argentina, especially, the American missionaries were viewed very, very highly. Mm-hmm. And if you're not careful, if you're not examining that, you could take advantage of that and or misuse that. And I think within this context, within working with those who are dealing with homelessness or poverty, it can become like I've got it figured out. I'm going to tell you how to get it figured out, and you're going to follow me and follow what I tell you to do. I've got it. And that's very othering, mm-hmm. and it's very hierarchical, which when we do this kind of work, people are coming, like the work that I get to do for my day job is people come to me and hope that I can help them with something. So it has to be intentional to recognize, like, it can't just be me.
Yeah.
And fortunately, it doesn't take long for them and myself to realize I'm not, I'm not always the answer.
I'm not a savior.
I can't,
Right.
And that the first couple of times I had to actively tell someone I didn't have a solution for them after they kind of got their hopes up. Mm-hmm. It's very painful, and I think that helps eliminate some of that heroism. I've been accused of doing it because I feel good about it, and it makes me feel good that I get to help people. Right. And we've talked about the fact it doesn't take very long for you to hit the wall on that and go, whoa, no, that feels the opposite of good.
If this is worthy of doing, if you really care about it, would you do it if people absolutely hated you for doing it or whatever? That's the real calling there. Like, is this worthy of it, even if there's no praise involved or whatever? I think the other aspect is how you approach it, your posture toward it. So, are you going to be a hero? Are you going to be a savior? Or are you going to be a servant? Are you going to be an advocate? And that's really a big difference. And I think that's even healthier for the hero to see themselves as an advocate or see themselves as somebody helping serve others, because it also, like, because there is going to be failures in there. There's going to be things that you just can't do, or you can't, help somebody with, or somebody's going to sabotage their own efforts, things like that. And so recognizing that, like, it's just a long, slow walk with somebody, and a sort of, I guess the best word, like long-suffering type of service, and there's just got to be humility involved with that, because so much of what Gather does, and a lot of service, is lining up services, like helping people get to these things, but you don't always control the things that you line up for them. Like, there's a million things that can go wrong,
Yeah. Yep. Like, yeah. So many examples there. But I don't remember what I was going to say. It was going to be a good one, though.
It was good. Write that down as something that really profound. Nate was going to say something profound. You just have to guess what it was.
Oh, so, I remember what I was going to say. Oh, just the importance of self-examination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And others' examination, and having conversations with people when things don't go well, and just talking through how that makes me feel, and acknowledge I really wanted to be the one that got to figure this out for someone.
Yeah.
And be the one that got to celebrate the big milestone or whatever. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's just not the case. And like you said, and recognizing that's okay, and if you do it for long enough, you're going to experience that over and over again with people.
Yeah. When you set this table up, you could have cleaned it first. There's like there's like coffee right here, some sugar, I think. This place is a mess, man. Anyways, that's unrelated to the topic at hand. I just realized I'm like sitting in filth. Okay, so then he shifts focus here, and he gets into don't do that. I would not do that if I were you.
If you didn't watch the video, you should go watch it. No, just kidding.
He gets into Matthew 25, and this section's titled, when was it that we saw you? And so why don't you just you summarize Matthew 25
Yeah,
for listeners?
So Jesus is talking to his followers and laying out, this scenario at the end of the world or whatever, judgment, if you will. And he's separating people, sheep and goats. And he says, he looks at the sheep and he says, when I was naked, you clothed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And they look at him and they go, Lord, when did we see you hungry or in prison or naked or need something to drink? And he says, whenever you've done it to one of the least of these, you've done it unto me. And likewise, but the opposite for those that didn't do it to the least of these, he says, away from me, to the place of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it's this, that's the, the line of demarcation is, did you do this unto the least of these? When they were hungry, when they were thirsty, when they were in prison, when they needed clothing.
It should be a pretty sobering parable, I think, and this is one of I return to this parable often for multiple reasons. One of which is it should be kind of unsettling because those that thought they were doing the right thing ended up not doing the right thing. And those that were doing the right thing also did not know they were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It's less cerebral and more of like a posture toward something. But it should be like...
Yeah, that is interesting, actually, when you think about it.
Because they were surprised.
They're like, when did we do this?
Do this. And he says, we did this, this, and this. And that is just scary. That's a scary thought. And I return to it often for reflection to make sure that I'm always checking myself, always like asking questions like, is this the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Am I pursuing the right thing? And I'm human. I fail at my attempts to be kind or gracious or loving or caring or whatever. I run out of patience just as much as anybody else, probably more than many. But that... I think the parable is just so decentering that we just have to kind of have this sort of faith that we are pursuing what God's calling us to do. And this isn't like, he's not talking about big things like you go start this whole thing, go to Argentina or go to college, whatever. No, I mean, I think it's the posture and the way in which we live our lives is what he's talking about. And that these things can be expressed in a myriad of small ways. I mean, I think of Robin Pedrizzetti and the work she does for Free Hot Soup. Mm-hmm. I mean, she is just this amazing dedicated worker who's quiet and strong and gentle and firm. She's this kind of mix of opposites who just shows up and does the work. Mm-hmm. And it's not, it's not magical. It's not whatever. It's just a very pragmatic way of doing this.
When you were talking about the hiddenness of it, I just all of a sudden got the image of in the movie Hook when the Lost Boys are looking at
the
Peter's
food, right?
at Peter's face, and the little boy gets his hands on his face, and he's like, oh, there you are, Peter. I could just picture myself working with someone, and I'm like, okay, I just really right now I really need to see Jesus, so I'm gonna put my hands on your face and just smush the face together and be like, oh, there you are, Jesus. It's not like some
that was the weirdest analogy you've ever given.
Thing was hidden, right? But I think about it in one client I have right now who shows up all the time looking for me because this person cannot keep straight where he's there's serious disorientation. I don't know what all of this going on, but every time they can show up at any given moment, and it can be something where, what am I going to do? How am I going to react to this person who the reason they're looking for me is because in their world, they know that if I'm lost or if I don't know what to do, that somehow they've got a honing beacon on me, and I can respond in a way that can just be like comforting and peace giving, and then also for me recognizing like I get in this scenario get to be a conduit to this person of care, and then in that like also challenges the way that I view my worship to God, in that I'm meeting Jesus in that person.
Yeah. And I think it was a very odd analogy, but it's that idea of touch, right? Like that proximity once again, like, and touching is a very unique, one of our unique senses in that you can't touch something without it touching you. Right.
And that, I think this particular example of this client, his wallet got stolen, and he's sitting there and he's super upset and he's crying and he's looking at me going, I'm so sorry I did this, because there's so much trauma in the background.
They internalize the shame of
in
that.
that moment, I just want to like growl, and I did. I don't normally do that, but I just like touch him on the shoulder and just be like, hey, you're okay. You didn't do anything. And just, but yeah, like,
and I think
it's profound.
I think that does
that is
a
profound.
shift in theology there, where, and I think especially like today, there's a type of theology that sees Jesus in power, sees Jesus in strength and might, and those things are in the Bible. I don't want to diminish those, but it's a very economic way of seeing things. And what he's getting at here is this idea of seeing Christ in the weak and the vulnerable. You need to add that into your theology too. You need to also consider the fact that, Christ died at the hands of the state, that he, willingly gave himself up, that he, he was also showed weakness in Gethsemane, the take this cup from me, but your will, God, sort of thing. And he goes on to go back to the book here. The quote that he kind of leaves off of is that we should come to recognize the overall patterns and dynamics that put and keep people in the position of homelessness, even as we focus on the unique stories and personhood of the individuals we meet. Christ is both each and every one of them. So it's a very kind of enchanted way of viewing the world, as well as sort of our upside down Savior. That it's we want things to be powerful. We want things to be in strength and control and whatever. And Jesus modeled a radical type of humility and submission, which aren't words that people are using today when it comes to faith and stuff. And so, anyways, any comments? Was that really profound, do you think?
Yeah, well, and that's that is part of the challenge, I think, even in going through a journey like Kevin and I, or I even think of my own life of like maybe putting aside a calling towards a public ministry of growth and of strength and of power, towards moving towards service of the least of these or towards the marginalized, is that in it, like, it can become, preachy in the sense of like, you got to go do what I just did, or you're, and I think that's where the heroism can kind of come in, and why Kevin and I writes about it.
Or there's only one way to do this.
Yeah. And that is to go this trajectory. But there is also an element of it that you do see that in Jesus's life, of him constantly putting off the possibility of more to seek the less, and the possibility of, being more important than to go and hang out with the kids, or, like that kind of thing.
Bring the outside in, tear the roof off the place. And yeah, I had a friend that when I first went through this book, I had invited people to read it with me if they wanted to, and I would write about each chapter. And a friend who, she got the book and you know, she didn't always like let me know like where she was at, but I was like, hey, I reached out. I was like, what do you thinking of the book? What are you thinking of? And she was like, this book has been so valuable in helping me understand even like members of my own family. So this isn't even like some crazy ministry style stuff. We all have family members, I don't think that there's a person around that hasn't been touched by, homelessness or addiction or mental health stuff. Like it's everywhere. And you don't realize it when you look around in the store, you're standing in line and everybody has some crazy story. I mean, that's what I've learned so much through these interviews that I've done through the Lung Letters. Man, I just can't believe that some people are still here to even share their story, but it's not, what she was expressing wasn't some huge ministry or going, it's even just changing the way we see things, having maybe a different understanding, trauma-informed care, like trying to, and it helped her with some members of her family and, just trying to navigate that. So it doesn't always have to be some big, ministry-oriented thing.
Well,
so much as a life of like living a certain way.
Yeah, and there is an element of that. I think that to certain people, and it goes back to even what Kevin and I says, like, what if I do like this? Or what if this does change the way that I view things? And I think that that's part of the challenge within this book is like, are you open to letting things change you, to transform you, to help you see God differently? When you see God in the face of the marginalized, the broken, the transgender, the whoever it is that's in front of you.
Are we willing to be wrong?
Yeah. It does require an element of humility to desire that. And I think that's part of the power of it too.
Yeah. No, definitely. It's, going back to Matthew 25, like it should be decentering. It should be like this constant asking of ourselves, like readjusting as we go sort of thing, recalibration. And yeah, I find that I'm constantly doing that. I'm always reviewing kind of what I've said. I've always trying to kind of replay conversations in my head, and if I have to go apologize to somebody, I try to go do that as well. Like just constant reflection. Anyways, okay. So the next section here, this is what I think is kind of a important part of this chapter. It's titled Resistant. And in it, he's going to talk about service resistant people or whatever. And he starts out with Nicholas's story. Nicholas is a heroin addict that, people might not know this, but there's certain drugs you can't just easily like quit.
Yeah, you can't detox from them easily or on your own safely.
Usually, so alcohol is one. People might not realize that. You can, but it's not considered safe to do so.
Well, and it depends on how severe it is.
Yeah. So this Nicholas, he's, finally decides to get clean. He's out on the street. He is just going through, withdrawals on a Friday afternoon, and finally reaches out and says, I think I'm ready to get help now. And Kevin is both like happy to hear that, but also it just makes him a little nervous, not because he doesn't want him to get help, but because he recognizes that this is the hard part of this transition, is getting everything lined up. And and so he goes in, he gets him a bed and lines up everything in the afternoon, and goes out to tell Nicholas. And he's like, I'll give you a ride. And Nicholas is like, oh, where is it at? He says it's in Skid Row. And Nicholas says, yeah, forget it. And he walks off. And so this is an example he uses as somebody that would, from all appearances, appear to be service resistant. They don't want to get help.
Yeah.
But what he goes on to say is that, having to get treatment in the middle of Skid Row is like going to a dentist in the middle of a candy store. You might get your needs met while you're there, but the minute you step out, you're right in the environment that can be deleterious to your continued success.
Yeah.
And
he doesn't talk about it, but in the story, we don't know Nicholas's history with going to treatment. If he's done it before and he's had an experience before, he knows, he doesn't want to repeat experience. I know for a lot of folks, they've tried treatment or they've done detox more than one time before it quote unquote sticks, if you will.
Yeah. And that's recurrent. Like a lot of the people that I've talked to, on average, it's like 6 times before
they try starting recovery before they get
before they
some
find
traction.
success. And a lot of that, even our own, Charles went through many different programs for his alcoholism. Some were more effective than others before he found success.
Yeah.
And so that's pretty common. You got to ask, like, there's a lot of factors involved in all of this.
Yeah.
It's not just people want a one size fits all, which would be nice, but and people have different needs. I mean, sometimes these things are so tightly braided that it's hard to get the service to suss apart all the things to treat them at the same time if you can. You know?
And it is one of those weird things when you're working with folks and somebody comes to you and says, "I'm ready." I've watched our team just do whatever they can to pull any strings they can to call the one person they've got a connection with to try and get somebody into a bed where they can move forward, whether it's detox or inpatient. And it's really hard because lining everything up at the moment that someone says, "I'm ready," is so hard and yet so important. And that's part of the system that makes it very difficult. Like I think of an example for me, like somebody showed up to do an interview for coordinated entry, and they mentioned, well, it'd probably be good if I got clean, before I got a place to live, because I'm going to have a hard time renting if I'm using. And so then the question got asked, like, do you want to do that today? And they said, yeah, okay. So we took them to detox, and but after doing that, if you've done that a bunch, and then he got out and didn't have a bed in inpatient treatment and didn't want to do that at that point and went back to using. And it's like for the social workers or for the people that are doing this work, there's a lot of that, a step forward and steps back. But to stay, they stay ready to go at all times. But
and
somebody could look at that person the next time somebody offers them detox, and they could be resistant to it.
Right. And the landscape changes.
Yeah.
What's available, what's not available can shift. And I know in Washington State, they're having a real struggle with providing enough beds for certain services that are needed. And he goes on, I'm going to quote, this is kind of a larger chunk, but I think it kind of captures one of the points he's going to make here. So, quote, "In the wake of the devastating impact of the 2008 recession, Skid Row couldn't expand much further because of ongoing gentrification in downtown, so homelessness exploded across LA. Many people simply started their experience of homelessness in the neighborhood where they had rented or owned. However, all the needed resources to serve them, such as rehabs, detox centers, and housing, continued to mostly be welcomed only in Skid Row. Through a combination of denial, contempt, and misunderstanding, neighborhoods across LA refused time and again to establish necessary resources in their own communities. A byproduct of this community-wide stubbornness is that people like Nicholas often get labeled as service resistant. This moniker saddles so many people experiencing homelessness, most often used by service providers and politicians to draw distinctions between groups of people experiencing homelessness, those they believe that they can help and those they consider unhelpable. But in the story I just told, who was truly service resistant? I would argue that the neighborhoods, not Nicholas, deserve that label." And he's pretty, he hits pretty hard on this point. And I personally want to just take a little bit wider perspective and recognize that all this stuff, getting this stuff lined up, is difficult. I think that there can be impediments imposed by, politicians or whatever, or even some of the difficulty of navigating some of these services is just so insane that you can't expect somebody, not to just be able to navigate it themselves. Yeah. But there is the idea that, if you factor all this in, it's just not an obvious thing to label somebody as service resistant. Not knowing their background, not knowing what they're dealing with, not knowing what their needs are, not knowing what their family is. Like, it's real difficult.
Take the night by night shelter, for example. I have conversations with people all the time, and I will ask them, have you considered staying at the night by night shelter? And they'll say, no, I won't stay there. And they have so many different reasons. And a lot of times, if you're dealing with somebody who's got severe PTSD, being in an environment surrounded by people in an area that you can't control the inputs, it's so overwhelming to them, they'd rather be outside. And that's, like when I talk to them and I get to hear their story, it makes a ton of sense. I've stepped into the shelter and they're trying the best that they can to run a tight ship.
Right.
But it's hard.
But you're going to take, 50 people and put them all in one area or something. I mean, it's a lot of work. And like you said, the shelter's doing a good job of trying their hardest to provide that service. But it's the only service around.
So when somebody says, no, I don't want to stay in the shelter, that's not just them being service resistant. They have a story and a reason for that.
I mean, Brooke, our own Brooke Reeder, who was the one that actually, my first interview for this podcast, she talks about how she would choose not to stay in a shelter for fear of harm coming to her. This wasn't our shelter down here. She'd rather sleep out like in a tent by the tracks than this, because she could control that environment easier than being in a shelter. Yeah. And I think that's just the awareness that, the person isn't service resistant every time out of some sort of obstinance or defiance. There's like a legitimate reason why they would struggle with that. And I think most people would. If you took, somebody and be like, hey, go spend the night in the shelter and see how you feel, think about how that would feel to do that for a week. Do you think you'd be able to accomplish the other things that you need to do in your week? And that would be a real challenge, with everything on your back too.
And that's something too, like a big factor is that folks who are they're not in permanent housing, they get a routine and they have a plan and they get comfortable with an area. And, if you're offering services in another area that they're uncomfortable with, it's another factor in it that makes it very difficult. I had a client that, got up in a hotel and woke up in the morning and didn't know where he was and was out of his routine and freaked out, he's...
To be fair, I've done that on vacation.
Yeah.
I forgot that
because they didn't know where the next move was for them.
No, and think about it from a strategy point of view, or
and that's not every person, by the way.
But being strategic about it, though, people are usually in the location they're in because they're familiar with it. They know where they can go get the things they need within walking distance. They know who is safe around them and who is not safe. Like, you build this sort of mental map of how to navigate the streets, right? And if somebody were to pick you up and drop you off in Olympia, you might not know, don't go to this part of town, or don't be over here, or the people over here are going to do, all this other stuff. And he talks about here, like, he heard some police officers describing a whole encampment as service resistant because the officers pulled up and said, hey, we'll take you all to a shelter, anybody that wants to go. And nobody took them up on the offer. And so if you looked at that just from that perspective, it would seem like, they want to live there. But then when you look it up and you find out that where they want to take them was 17 miles away, and they couldn't take all of their belongings and whatever. Well, now the picture gets a little bit more complicated. In that case, the service they were offering them was going to put them in an even more vulnerable position, which vulnerability is a key part in a lot of these discussions. Is there a way that we can do that doesn't put them in a more vulnerable position, or keeps them in an area they understand and can navigate?
Yeah. Yeah. And on top of that, like, the people who are asking them whether they want to go or not are also wearing a uniform of which they may or may not have a lot of trust based on how many times they've been ticketed or
on the street or whatever.
And that's not the police officer's fault, right? Like, they may genuinely have wanted to help, which I think a lot of them actually do. They have a tough job because they're the ones get called on. If it's not Gather, it's the police that are getting called to go and move them on, and they are in a difficult
No,
a difficult
I mean,
spot.
it's like, and that's everybody involved. You know, I know several police officers, both Trade Police Department and the sheriff's office, good people. They care. They love people. You know, that they're limited in what they can do and how they can respond. They also have, you know, their duties to perform, and likewise, same thing with like EMT services or something like that, where all of them thankless jobs, right? Like you're gonna lose with somebody depending on how you respond to a situation. And this is all really complicated. I guess the point is there's no like super easy solutions.
But labeling people service resistant based
it's
on
not helpful.
Well, and based on an experience or based on one story
Or limited.
you know, it's
and he goes on to say in the book that, you know, himself, he's never met a truly service resistant person. He's talked about being cussed out. He's talked about somebody told him, you know, all these other like really bad responses. But once those people developed a relationship and developed a way, and there was opportunities that provided them sort of autonomy as well as care. You know, it's like kind of bringing people in out from the cold is not easy to do. The longer they're out there, the harder it is for them to kind of reintegrate, for one, and then two, it's there's a lot of everybody's unique, and the responses they have are and what they need are going to be unique, and having just a one size fits all type thing is going to be a struggle, you know, and so he kind of ends with a friend who has a quote, you know, people are not service resistant, services are people resistant. And I think I'd probably put myself somewhere in the middle of that. I would say that there are definitely some people that are very difficult to work with and, you know, can be a challenge. But also navigating these services it's just ridiculously hard. And I hear the work that you do and many others. And I mean, even let's go back to the shelter here. That's a lot of work. That's just a ton of work. And with the resources that they have, they're doing what they can, you know? It's so much effort having to put in.
Yeah. And when you tried to work in the system and you've been hopes up and then smashed, that plays into some of the service resistance. And I think I've mentioned that a couple of times already, but just, I know for me, walking with people and just hoping beyond, you know, like my own ability, just that this next thing will be the thing that will help them get over the hump. And then to have a technicality come up that either disqualifies them
and
or
they're thinking, I've heard this before.
Yep.
We've been through this before.
Yep.
Last time I went through this, I lost all my belongings. You know, like there's going to be some sort of history there that you're working with or against.
Yep. So it's not just a no when they say no, but questioning why. And really that's one of the things I think that's great with, I get to build relationships with people. And that's one of the big things that, you know, we try really hard at Gather is that we're actually walking with people and building relationship in every program. It's not just I have a service for you, but like trying to get to know the stories and understand what programs are out there and point them in the right direction. And
it's a lot of coordinating. So then his next section is seeing and sinning. He bases this off of John chapter 9, where a blind man is sitting outside the gate of a city, and Jesus' disciples ask him, you know, who sinned that this person ended up this way. And he goes a lot into it, but I think the sort of wrap up is that that's just the wrong way to even be looking at it. So we look at people and we instantly start to try to size them up or categorize them and their situation to fit into this box here, you know? So it's either their fault or it's this or this or this, you know, like who's at fault here? Who's to blame? And I think the danger of that is that we're fallible people. Like we do not have, we can get things wrong, but we also don't have the whole picture. We don't know the history of the person. We don't know their family background, like all this other stuff.
Well, and then the other implication too that the Bible, the scripture isn't really about this, but I think as it relates to what we're talking about is, does it matter as to whether or not you'd help them or not? If
Right.
they're there because of their sin or if they're there because of somebody else's sin.
Certainly not when it comes to things like food,
Right.
water, like things we need to exist.
But I think the conversation does need to happen for people, if they're wrestling with this of like, in your mind, does that matter? And I think for a lot of people, it does matter. If it's their own choice, then no, don't help them. But if it, but how do you separate, right?
Well, and
And-
people make self-destructive choices. What do we do for people who are self-destructive?
Yeah.
Do we help them navigate that? Or do we let them destruct?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. And then like, if they make self-destructive choices, do you know what it was like to grow up with an alcoholic mother who set fire to the house multiple times and who, killed your pet when you did something wrong? And,
you don't even know the background they have.
The stories that I've heard from people that have made self-destructive choices in their life, of their history, it's just, you can't make it up. Like if that happened to me, I don't know where I'd be. I have parents who love me. And
there's kind of an assumption there is that everybody is starting from the same cognitive state and background when they're making decisions.
Right.
Okay, I know how I would do, or most people would do in this situation. They're not doing it. Therefore, they're, choosing this. And yes, they're choosing it, but go look at their whole history. Try to learn more about them. I remember talking to a pastor who's, a friend of mine, and we were talking about an individual that attended the church. He's really struggled and having a hard time. And I just remember that pastor going, man, I'll be honest, the kid just didn't even have a chance. And he filled me in a little bit of the background that this kid had to go through. And it was like, and him saying that wasn't to put that kid down. Matter of fact, that kid, he's an adult now, and he's really growing, and he's learning to look at his background and continually revisit like this sort of upbringing he's had.
Mm-hmm.
But like that needs to be a part of the conversation.
Yeah.
If we just stand on the outside, or if we just eyeball it, or if we whatever, we're likely to get it wrong, and we're likely to push a button or treat somebody in a way that we didn't know they have a whole history of being treated this way, and it's going to set them off, or you're gonna lose them or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
and getting back to like Jesus is telling them this, or asking him this question, or him being asked this question, and his response. I think even though it's not the same context, the idea there though is like, that's not the point. Like, and I think for us as followers of Jesus, when we get to dealing with people who are living in broken circumstances, whether it's homelessness or poverty or addiction, we can look at it and go, or we could have a tendency to want to look at it and go, whose problem was this? Was this because of the parents, or was this because of their choices? I think we can just kind of say, like Jesus did, that's not the point.
right. The economic
let's not
way of
look back.
thinking about helping people, like,
Yeah.
okay, if you do this, I'll do this. If I get that tendency, and that's how we function in a lot of ways. But we're talking about a type of self-destruction, a type of behavior that doesn't always cooperate like that. Well, what needs to be offered is community.
Mm-hmm.
Constantly getting them help, getting them services that they need, whatever, but also like bringing them into the fold. And I'm not talking like church fold or whatever. I'm talking about like how can we start to reintegrate people into the community again?
Mm-hmm.
And this us versus them, or this high bar that they have to jump over, okay, now you're in sort of thing. They're just not going to jump it. They're just not going to do it. And they're still going to exist. So have you moved anything further? No. You can displace them. You can squeeze the balloon and it'll go somewhere else. But maybe, and that's what you can do if you don't want, like if you just want the problem to go away.
Yeah.
But if you want to solve the issue, I mean, there's a lot of things that a person can do personally, but most of it starts relationally.
Well, And that's what you're getting at with the squeezing the balloon. That's one of the reasons why culture or communities want to label them as service resistant, because if you do that, then you have kind of an ability to move them on.
Yeah.
We've asked them and they said no, and so they're gone.
And it's usually that first pass. There's usually, but can we get more creative in that? Can we find more creative solutions? Can we constantly keep working the problem?
Whereas somebody who's been betrayed by those closest to them with immense pain and trauma in their background, they may be exactly looking for the response of being kicked out and told they're no good, because that's what they expect. And so but you sticking with them and you showing up even after they've cursed you out.
Right.
That's the community that I think as Christ followers, that's the kind of community that we want.
And once again, this doesn't have to be done professionally. We're just talking about like how we carry ourselves in the community, the type of response we have to do. Like not everybody can go be a social worker.
No.
But we can all continue and try to continue giving humanity to others, and this sort of long-suffering patience of what's it going to take to help people. And there's healthy boundaries to have in there. There's all sorts of stuff that this conversation could go into.
Yeah.
But I think our solutions need to be more creative and more patient and a little less, stick versus carrot type thing,
Yeah.
And anyways, and so he wraps this up and basically with a story about Michael. Michael needed had some doctor's appointments to go through. He was having a hard time seeing, and
went to a free clinic.
Yeah, and get lined up, and then he gets bifocals because this will help him see, and then they have to drive 25 miles.
10 weeks later.
Yeah, 10 weeks later. It takes 10 weeks and then 25 miles to get a person who is like, needing this care that can't provide it themselves.
Doesn't have transportation.
So he goes and gets it, and they share this sort of care. They love the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and this was at the time the End Game had come out or something like that. And the author is definitely like that's definitely his thing. He loves comic books. He loves that, and he gets this guy, the End Game,
Infinity Wars and End Game.
Yeah. And so he can watch it. Yeah. And
now that he's got his glasses.
And he drops him off at home, and then he said it was like literally like 2 hours, 30 minutes to the
the movie was 2 hours and 29 minutes, and 2 hours and 30 minutes later he got a text.
And I think his point of that was it ties into the whole idea of seeing, right? But also that relationship there.
Yeah.
Like he cared about the person cared about him. There's this sort of like give and take that it's a vulnerability. It's not a position of power necessarily, even though you're helping that person. It's not, it's that level playing field, not treating people hierarchically. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge. There's many ways to do that. So, well, overall, what do you think of the chapter?
I think it's important. I think it's really important, and just something to ask is, how am I seeing, and in what ways how have I changed how I see, and how that might impact others and
the way we approach the world.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode. We've got several more chapters to do. Hopefully we will be a little quicker on the draw here than we have been.
No more emergency surgeries.
Yeah. So once again, we just want to reiterate that is Kayla's fault. I'm sorry, Kayla. And hopefully we can get a little better cadence here and get these things out the door. So, all right, Nate. Thank you.
Yeah,
and thanks,
Mitch,
for listening.
Thanks for your hard work on this too.
Oh, yeah. And appreciate you co-hosting and reading. I know you don't have time for
listening.
So,
I listened to the audiobook.
All right. Well, I just want to thank the Long Letter podcast listeners, audience, all dozens of you. Appreciate your listening in, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.